McHenry, Illinois. Located 55 miles northwest of Chicago. Known as the gateway to the chain of lakes. The city's motto, the heart of the Fox River. A city growing and thriving in the 21st century. A city with a strong agricultural history. But what is that history? And how did it affect the McHenry we have today?
Hi, I'm Ed Collins. I'm the Director of Land Preservation and Natural Resources for the McHenry County Conservation District. You're in what's often referred to as the crown jewel of the Conservation District Park System, and that's Glacial Park. It gets its name because this is an area that was heavily impacted by the glacier's advance and their retreat over the last 20,000 years. And if you were to go down a couple hundred feet in McHenry County, you would find a much older landscape than the glaciers. There was once an ocean here, and as sea animals died and floated down to the bottom and became fossilized, a reef formed. In many parts of McHenry County, the bedrock is composed of a 250 million year old coral reef that is now fossilized. Think of a bulldozer moving something in front of it. The glaciers are enormous bulldozers, and they're tearing up the landscape that has existed for a long time in front of them. They're incorporating it into the body of ice and snow, and they're moving enormous amounts of material, in this case, south with them. And they drive the plant and animal communities that have existed prior to the ice advancing into what are called refugias. And a refugia is just like it sounds. It's a place of refuge, a place where those plant and animal communities can survive. And so the history of our area starts with the natural communities that were here 25, 30,000 years ago being pushed south. The oaks that we're so familiar with, they sat out the glaciation in the Ozark Highlands, down in the Ozark Mountains and areas like southern Illinois. But it takes a long time for the ice to leave this area. And when it does, the landscape encounters change after change in terms of what kinds of plants and animals move back in. And that's important for where we live because those plant communities are going to shape the soil over time. And they're going to leave us with one of the richest soil legacies, not in North America, but in the world.
I'm Bob Oya. I'm a soil scientist and work for the McHenry Lake Soil and Water Conservation District. The soil in the McHenry area is a very important resource for us. It's very rich agriculturally. The soil developed right after the glaciers started leaving, and that was about 12,000 years ago. That sounds like a long time, but actually that's quite young compared to soils down in southeast U.S., for instance. Those are hundreds of thousands of years old.
The types of plants and animals that moved in after the glaciers, they collided at the southern end of Lake Michigan, right where we live. So we live in one of the richest floristic communities anywhere in the United States.
Plants use a lot from soils. The three macronutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. They also use other things in the soil, other nutrients, calcium, sulfur. And when you have a younger soil, there's more of those nutrients available and still in the soil. There's three particle sizes in soil: sand, which is the biggest, and then silt, which is a medium-sized particle, and clay, which is the finest. Of those three, silt can blow the easiest, so it's the silt that blew around the state of Illinois with these huge dust storms. Over in McHenry County and McHenry area, we have anywhere from, maybe a foot to maybe 3 or 4 feet of loess or silty material covering the top of the soil, so it's right there where the plants are growing. Silt has the ability to hold a lot of water for plants to use.
Today there are even places in McHenry County where you can see that old landscape from 18,000 years ago. You may have visited Volo Bog. It's a state-recognized natural area, and one of the big features is, at the center of the site is a tamarack bog that's dominated by tamarack trees. And you don't find those in our part of the country anymore because they retreated north as the ice retreated north. So that's a little vestige of what that landscape looked like 14,000 years ago, and it's still here on the landscape today. all kinds of diverse trees everywhere in the landscape. The oaks are there. They're in little dry parts of the landscape on west-facing slopes or on little openings. The prairie is there, inside clearings in the forest. But really what dominates is this magnificent, very thick forest. And then about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, the climate starts to dry very dramatically. There are prolonged droughts. We've been in droughts before. They last a few months. They might last a year. But these are drought conditions that last for 10 years or 20 years. And they dry the landscape out. And as that happens, fire becomes more frequent. So these landscape scale fires set by lightning cross the landscape. And they really select for the plants that can survive that harshness. So our landscape in McHenry County is composed of the survivors of fire and ice, the plants and animals that were the toughest that could do that. The oaks are very good at surviving that. So are prairie plants. We talked a little bit about the natural communities that moved into the area as the ice melted, and those that eventually came to dominate the landscape when the first eastern settlers arrived. But there have been people here for a long time. Native Americans literally hunted in front of the ice sheet as it was melting. There were mammoths and mastodons. There were large bison that were here. There were large predators, wolves, and also lions.
My name is Dan Malone. I'm a Great Lakes archaeologist. I do archaeology throughout the Chicagoland area. Today we're going to talk about the prehistory, the people who lived within McHenry County 13,000 years. That's how long people have lived within this area, quite frankly, within Illinois and within this region. 13,000 years. Now think about that timeline. And when we look at that, we look at the span of my arms, 13,000 years being here, and here we are, this finger right over here. And when we look at my thumb, which I'm wiggling, let's say about the 1830s, you could see how close we are in 2023 to that period when the indigenous people were unfortunately removed from the area. We have some stone tools or lithics on the table in front of me. So these same people who made the tools that were found here in McHenry County are the same people who may have traveled up into what is southern Wisconsin now, or down through the Chicagoland area, or even central Illinois. These people moved about during different seasons to do different things in order to survive on the landscape. The Paleo-Indian lived here during the Pleistocene epoch, okay? So that means Ice Age. Paleo-Indians traveled in very small groups. They were not traveling around with hundreds of people. We're talking about smaller family groups. Anywhere between 20 or less people were roaming the landscape and going after megafauna. During this period, as the environment started to warm up, the megafauna, the large animals, either moved out or died. And now we have deer on the landscape. We have the waterfowl that we have, the ducks, the geese, and whatnot. We have crayfish, we have clams. These are things that these people are going to start to utilize. And so they had to design a toolkit in order to go after these animals, especially something as fast as a deer. The archaic people had what is called an atlatl. That is this device. It's a catapult, okay? It literally will launch a dart like this, and it can be flung far and fast. And so the idea is that you notch it on the back and hold it, and you can creep up upon your quarry and you can launch your dart. And this will catapult it, and this dart will fly very quickly through the air and hit its target. And we actually have an atlatl point here, which dates back to the early archaic period. And the stone tip would have fit and would have had a little bit of sinew around it to hold it in place. And this is the actual tip that would have been used to hunt deer on the landscape. Unlike the Paleo-Indian people, the archaic people over time started to explore the landscape. They started to utilize the things that the landscape had to offer. And so with that, we have an axe head. And even the axe head over time will change. So we have what's called a full groove axe, and you can see the groove here. would have been hafted onto a handle, and you can take down a tree in roughly 8 minutes with something like this and process the wood. And over time, even that toolkit, the axe head developed. So this is called a 3/4 grooved axe head. It's got a flat bottom. This could be secured much better than the full grooved axe. So we have the two examples here of what an early archaic toolkit would have looked like. We move from the archaic period to the woodland period. So here we have early woodland period and middle woodland period tools that would have been used as knives, and they would have been hafted with a handle of either bone, antler, or wood. We have permanent dwellings on the landscape. We have people that are now starting to create mounds to bury their dead. We have annual seed crops. These were people that utilized the landscape in a different way. Starting around the middle woodland period to see regional trade. So these are people that are going about the entire region and trading with other groups of people. It is here in the late woodland period that we have bows and arrows. And that is something that replaces the earlier atlatls and spears and things like that. And it makes gathering game faster than earlier methods. So much so that they started to really impact the landscape. We also see at this point corn agriculture. They had permanent dwellings, permanent villages within the area that would one day become McHenry County. Now you have people trading with people as far north as Canada, as far south as Mexico, and heading out west and east.
Ho-ho! Itakarunina hinakagari hapije rajaskara hochungskaga hingaida. Hanichari haipin. What I just said to you is, my friends, I greet you. It's a nice day today. My name is Ho-Chunk-Skaga, and I'm glad to see you all. My white name is Gerald Savage. My tribe comes from Green Bay, Wisconsin. We have settlements all the way up into Minnesota, down through Iowa, all the way down to St. Louis, up to Chicago, and back to Green Bay. We had a very big tribal area. Some of the Wisconsin archaeologists have said they've found artifacts from my tribe that date back 7,000 BC. You're probably noticing some of my regalia that I have on, and I call it regalia because that's what it is. It's not a costume, it's regalia. I'm a Bear Clan chief. I have the bear claw necklace on, which is indicative of my clan. We have 12 different clans in my tribe. We would wear the bone breastplate, and if you notice, I've got a bone choker on. These here would be old-time bulletproof vests because we would hunt the buffalo, we would hunt the deer, and they all have horns. And if they could put a horn into us, the neck is a real good place because it'll kill you, and the stomach is a real good place to kill you. Our history is an oral passed down history. It's not written. We used to walk this land long before anybody else was around here. We were fishermen, hunters, trappers, so we traded for fur with the French, the original people that came through here first. You are in the fur mecca of the world at one point in time. There was so much wildlife, and we were the preferred trading partners for the French because we gave them the furs that they wanted back in Europe. We were a very peaceful people which loved to hunt, fish, trap. We were farmers. I asked my grandfather when I was young, "Grandpa, how big were our cornfields?" He goes, "It's funny you would ask me that question. I asked my grandfather the same question, and he told me our cornfields were as far as a person could see 3 times. That's a pretty long way. When we practiced Three Sisters planting, we planted corn first. We would plant beans next to it, so the beans would run up the corn stalk, and then we would plant squash around that to keep the weeds down and keep some of the other animals out because they don't like the smell of the squash. The corn, the beans, and the squash can be dried and stored and used for winter feed. Same with the fish, any of the meat, the buffalo meat, the deer meat. We lived in a very blessed area. There was always good game to be had. There was always good fish to be had. This area was full of resources of many different types. You had mature oak trees, which gave you the acorns. We made flour of the acorns. The walnuts, we used the nuts. the hickory nuts. You can go through this whole area. The buffalo were plentiful in this area. The deer still are plentiful in this area. We only took what we needed.
So by the time the first Jesuits begin to explore this for France in the 1600s, our landscape is set. And this is how they describe it. As they come into our area, heading south to connect with the Mississippi River, the Jesuits write in their journals that this is the most beautiful area they have seen since they left Canada, that the savannas or the woods are open and filled with great herds of stags, and the prairie is verdant and beautiful, and those savannas look as though they were apple orchards planted by the hand of God for the pleasure of man's viewing. That's how they describe the place that we live in. That's how they describe the place that in the late 1830s and 1840s, the first settlers from the east will arrive and begin to make farms.
Hi, I'm Jeff Varda, and I'm a member of the McHenry Landmark Commission, the Chicago Treaty of 1833. It was a treaty between the United States and the Potawatomi tribe. The treaty removed them to west of the Mississippi, and they essentially lost 15 million acres to be replaced by land in Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma. One real reason is simply the philosophy about land. Europeans believed in individual land ownership and titles to land, where Native Americans believed in group usership of land. And the two philosophies just don't mix. So there were two acts. There was the Land Ordinance of 1785, which established the right of the United States to sell title to settlers west of the Appalachians. And then in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, we created the political possibility of turning this land into states, and that included Illinois. So we're heading towards this inevitable conflict that was going to occur. And then technology made it happen quicker. The existence of the Erie Canal, which connected the Atlantic Ocean through the Hudson River all the way to the Great Lakes, to Lake Erie, made access to the Midwest by waterways possible. And so now all those farmers that were really living a hard existence in New England, because it was rocky and it was tough farming. And it's one of the reasons that we had sheep here. We had so many sheep because they brought them with.
The people who've walked before us, it's changed so many different times over the years. This area was a Ho-Chunk area. Anything west of the Fox River would be more of a Ho-Chunk area. East of the Fox River, it was occupied by different tribes at different times.
So in 1833, there was to be a meeting, a treaty council in Chicago, right along the Chicago River, so downtown near where Fort Dearborn was. And it was quite a gathering. 6,000 Native Americans showed up. At that time, Chicago was a population of about 4,000 people. When the negotiations started, the American agents told the Potawatomi that they were awful lucky because the Great Father, President Jackson, was going to offer them a wonderful deal. And the Potawatomi chiefs responded that the Great Father must have been visited by a bad bird who had told him a lie, because they did not want to give up their lands. So that was the opening negotiations.
The Illinois Territory was given a kind of a mandate to clear out all of the Native Americans. And in the 1820s, the roundup started by a volunteer Illinois militia. The people were not being paid to be in the militia. They were given a weapon, and then they were given food, and they were volunteers. And they had to round up the natives, and they were taking them up through Wisconsin, and then we were eventually moved to the west. Some of the natives realized what was going on, and at night they would sneak out of the camp. If you were a volunteer, would you go into the woods at night after Native Americans? So a lot of them just let them slip off into the woods. In the 1830s, we had the Black Hawk Uprising, and we had a Potawatomi Uprising in Ottawa, Illinois. And at the time, this sparked fear in all of the people in Illinois. There was a renewed effort to make sure that Illinois was cleared out of any Native Americans.
The Chicago Treaty of 1833 cleared northern Illinois and the McHenry area for European settlement. And this is how quickly it happened. So in 1840, there were approximately 300 people. By 1850, there were 15,000 people. people in McHenry County. That's in a 10-year period, and almost all of them were farmers.
And it was a mistake by some of the pioneers to think that woodland soils or forest soils, they thought those were probably more productive at first because they had, big trees, big plants growing on them. They thought, oh, hey, this is more productive. And they found out it was actually opposite of that the prairie soils with the smaller plants were actually more productive for farming. So they kind of switched as they learned more to farm more of the old prairie soils than the forest soils.
Let's put ourselves in 1840 and you're arriving from New York State or Vermont. What would you expect to see in terms of wildlife in McHenry County? Well, just about everything that you could imagine in terms of large predators was here. There were wolves, and wolves persisted in McHenry County until the 1880s. And we have newspaper articles about wolves in the town of McHenry as late as 1880. There were bears here. There were mountain lions here. We had elk, and we had bison at one time in McHenry County. Those didn't persist long because they were hunted out very, very quickly. But other things that you wouldn't imagine as being McHenry County residents were here, and that would include river otters, and it would include bald eagles nesting and ospreys nesting.
Most Native American tribes, the eagles are very sacred. When we say our prayers, they go up with the smoke, and the eagle carries our prayers up to the Creator. Some tribes revere the owl. In my tribe, they're the messengers of death. When an owl comes to meet you, it's telling you somebody's going to pass. It's always kind of good to stay away from the owls.
My name is Kurt Bigalka. I am the administrator of the McHenry County Historical Society and Museum in Union. When you were a pioneer and you came to McHenry County, you either had to bring it with you, which wasn't all that easy. You had to make it or you had to do without. We have an 1843 log cabin that belonged to the Gannon family that 12 by 10 maybe, and you had 10 people living in there, and there was no such thing as personal space. There was no electricity. The walls are whitewashed to reflect the one candle that if you were lucky enough to render the pig fat from to light your way. You worked all day and slept at night with the snow sifting through the rafters on your face. But it was heaven compared to living just out in the woods. It was a process, and of course, early pioneers turned to agriculture. The land was good, the soils were good. They grew a lot of grain, a lot of alfalfa to try to sustain their cattle, and they grew vegetables to sustain themselves. There was a hunting rifle above the door so they could protect themselves and bring food to the table. So it was a very simple life. It was a hard life, but it kind of expanded from there.
My name is Thomas Hillier. I am the genealogy and local history librarian at the McHenry Public Library. It's a time of survival. You're just trying to put together a living for everybody. And they have diseases out there like typhoid and tuberculosis and a variety of fevers, especially younger children are very susceptible to. So that's part of the reason farms have such large families, not just to help around on the farm, but statistically, a lot of those kids just aren't going to make it. The more people you can get, the better. And by the 1920s, you're starting to see larger farms, more modern farms, more something we would probably relate to more.
I'm Nancy Fike. I'm the former administrator for the McHenry County Historical Society, and I was the first chairman of McHenry's Landmark Commission. McHenry gets its name actually from the death of a famous person. His name was William McHenry, and he was born in Kentucky. He was a Southerner, he was a slave owner, an Indian fighter, served at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and then when the Black Hawk War broke out, he served in the 3rd Spy Battalion, never came through McHenry though. He died in 1835, and they wanted to honor him because he also served in the state legislature. We know very little about him because he divorced. Photography was just coming in that time, and if there were a photograph of him, I am sure his wife did one of these.
I'm Pam Kellogg. I am with the McHenry Area Historical Society and the McHenry Landmark Commission. The first settlers were Dr. Christy Wheeler, the Reverend Joel Wheeler, who was his brother, John McGomber, the Boones, the McCullums, and Alexander Hanley. The early farmers were the Colbys, the Owens, and Alexander Hanley. The Owens, their farm and their home was over in the Green Street area. The Colbys settled around McCullum Lake. Alan P. Colby, he was on the west side where the West Shore Beach subdivision is now. Newell S. Colby owned the south part of what is today Lakeland Park, and Paige Colby was on the north side of the lake.
You'll see by the fields that are around here, the arrowheads that are left behind. You know, some of them are from kills, some of them are from misses.
When we're talking about the tools and the weapons, going back to the materials that we have here, these came from the Colby-Peterson farm site.
I'm Greg Lofgren. I'm president of the McHenry Area Historical Society. I'm a former member of the City McHenry Landmark Commission, and I taught 7th grade at McHenry Junior High. Peterson Farm came from the Colby family. Paige Colby arrived in McHenry in 1842 from Danville, Vermont. He was born in 1820 and died in 1905. He had 6 children after he married Methitable Smith. Charles was the oldest, and he moved over to this side of the farm and then its farmhouse here. And Charles and Mary Talbert had 2 children. The boy moved to California. The girl was Carolyn Colby, and she married Peter Peterson. Peter Peterson and Carolyn had 1 son, Kenneth, and Kenneth is the one that then inherited the farm. He had a son, Robert, and Robert is the last living relative on this particular farm. So this is a 5-generation farm, starting way back in 1842 when Paige bought 80 acres for $130. The farm increased to over hundreds of acres, 700 approximately, and City McHenry bought several of those pieces for Peterson Park, and then this piece here with the farm buildings was the last piece acquired by the city.
When I interviewed Bob, what I got a sense of was his strong desire that the efforts that he and others like him who farmed and worked the land and were so tied to it would not be built over, would not be totally lost, where there would be some place where you would be able to see the foundation, the origins of our growth as a community. It's almost like why we put tombstones up. We want to be remembered. We were there.
We are sitting in the living room of the Peterson family home. This was built in the mid-1850s. Paige Colby lived across the street with the first house, and some of the foundation is still there, they say.
Well, in 1850s, it's very much like kind of like we would probably think of kind of like almost like if you watch like Little House on the Prairie, something like that. You still got candles, you don't have running water in the house yet, so we're talking outhouses. By the 1920s, a lot of places have phones in their house, running water, and that kind of thing. You didn't get electricity in this until about the late 1920s, early 1930s. But even if it's running water, if it's just a pump in the house, that's still better than having to run to a well to get your water. It's definitely improving. And then once they get electricity, it's way easier, the lifestyle. Instead of having to build a fire to start cooking your breakfast, that kind of thing, in a stove, you can just turn it on. Little things like that just make things way more convenient for people.
Well, like a building, history has to have a foundation on which to build. And here in McHenry, our foundation was an agricultural one. And you can still see evidence of that by going out to the Colby-Peterson farm, where you'll see examples of what these farmers brought with them in terms of architectural styles.
This particular home is a Greek Revival home, built of stone. It is a typical mid-18th century type farmhouse because that was a style that was popular in the mid-1800s. Peterson still live in the area. Glenn Peterson just died. He was 90. His son still lives in the area on Green Street. And again, they have spent time out here. They've been in the hay barn, played in the back, in that big open area back there. Glenn told me where the outhouse was, off the back of the new kitchen there, off the garage. There are many people, many adults still living in McHenry that have had personal experiences with this particular farm. They have worked on the farm, or they've played on the farm, or they've lived on the farm.
We are sitting in the old Hanley flour mill on Crystal Lake Road and Mill Street. This building was built in 1870 by Alexander Hamilton Hanley and his 4 sons. And Alexander Hanley owned everything on Crystal Lake Road, from Elm Street all the way down to Dartmoor, and from the railroad tracks on the east to the west side of Boone Creek. He had 800 acres of farmland. Alexander Hanley walked, I think he was 21 years old, all the way from Olean, New York to McHenry, Illinois, on foot with no money in his pocket. Well, his father died when he was a year old. His mother moved in with her parents. They had something like 11 kids. And I imagine with 11 kids, there wasn't a lot of money. So when he decided to come out here, he just started walking. When he first came to McHenry and settled on the Fox River, he somehow bought oxen and he started tearing up the ground in southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois so that other farmers could start their homes and plant their fields. Eventually, when the government was selling land, he started buying acreage a little bit at a time. I think he started with 80 acres at $1.25 an acre, and then he added 40, and then he added 40, and eventually he started buying some from the farmers around him that owned some of this land until he had his 800 acres. He came here, he decided this is the piece of land that I want. He built a house. Subdivisions that are on his property now would be Whispering Oaks, Water's Edge, and part of the Fox Ridge subdivision. Also on that property is the McHenry Post Office, West Campus High School, and Ace Hardware. His livestock and his crops were probably typical of most farmers. He had horses, cows, pigs, chickens, I'm sure. I know he grew apples, corn, probably wheat, and clover seed. He had an ice business. He had a milk business. Yeah, he was an entrepreneur. He was very, very busy. He was also part of the school system in McHenry, part of the administration. By the late 60s, Hanley saw the need for a second flour mill. There was already a flour mill up on Green Street run by the Owen brothers. That was located where the Green Street Cafe is today. McHenry had just grown so much and there was so much farmland that they needed a second one, so he ran this as a flour mill. Well, he had a clay pit on his farm and he started making bricks and he decided to build the brick mill. It was called the McHenry Brick Mill and Champion Brickyards back when it first opened in 1870.
The soil itself in the McHenry area had other uses, a lot of sand and gravel deposits that, even some of the pioneers used.
This building is made from the bricks that he made by hand. The walls are 21 inches thick. They have that yellow, I always call this the little yellow brick mill. I believe that is common for this area. He had a beautiful Italianate Victorian home at the intersection of Crystal Lake Road and Lillian Street. That was made from the same bricks as the mill here. That's where he lived most of his life when he was in McHenry. Unfortunately, that house burned down in November of 1975. He had to dam Boone Creek to make a pond, which is still located west of West Campus between the Water's Edge subdivision and the Whispering Oaks subdivision. Then he dug a canal or a mill race just to the east of Boone Creek, and that ran all along the side of Boone Creek all the way up to almost near Elm Street, and then it curved east along with the creek. It ran through wooden pipes under the road and into the corner of the mill in the basement, and you can still see where the water came in to run the Leffel water wheel. Hanley himself had a milk business where he would ship milk on the train to Chicago. People ordered flour from the Hanley mill that could be shipped on the train. Yeah, that really opened up a lot of possibilities for income for the farmers. Hanley died in 1891 in May. He was thrown from his horse and carriage and suffered injuries from that, and a couple days later he died. His 4 sons built a canning factory just down the street, and when they were putting in the foundation, it was February, and they had to use dynamite, but because it was February, they had to warm the dynamite, so they put it in warm water. Well, there was an explosion. 3 people were killed, several were injured, and because there was no hospitals, they took the injured down to the Northwestern Hotel for treatment, and the doctors met them there.
The town, as it grew through the mid-1800s and into the 1900s, had many architectural styles that, again, were imitated not only from Chicago, other towns that had national styles of architecture. These people had these same things, and they wanted them out here in the town of McHenry. And of course, the farmers also wanted that same type of architecture. So we do have examples in McHenry of many of the national architectural styles.
For most of us, we don't recognize our history unless we're looking at it. So when you see a barn and it has a gambrel roof, that's part of our agricultural history and our agricultural history, because the first barns that were built, early barns, were gable barns. They didn't have a lot of cows. They didn't need to store a lot of feed for them, so you didn't need a lot of space up in the mow. However, by the 1870s, we were dairy producing and we had a lot more cows to feed, and we grew our own food for that. So what you can see visibly of our farming background are those gambrel roof barns. Look at how it opens up for more room for storage. And you'll see a perfect one right south of Edgebrook School in a beautiful grove of oaks.
McHenry County went from where we are now all the way to Lake Michigan.
The county seat was in McHenry. The border from Lake County split off, I believe, in like 1839 from McHenry County. And there was a big dispute about where that border ought to be. And originally they talked about it being at the Fox River, but it wound up actually going east of there into Lakemore. Well, when they did that, there was a push to have the county seat be more centralized in the middle of the county. So they brought it to Centerville, which later became Woodstock, and built a courthouse on the square, and the rest is history.
McHenry still has the original courthouse from 1840, which is at the corner of Riverside Drive and Pearl Street. The result was that most of the prominent people and prominent occupations went over to Woodstock, because at that particular point, you had more traffic for the court, you had more people that needed health from doctors, more businesses would have to be servicing these particular occupations. So it became more of a city, type situation versus a farming type situation, which McHenry stayed pretty much the same. A lot of the houses in McHenry, if you go on 120 Elm Street today, you'll see some of the big houses that were similar to those in Woodstock. But as 120 was widened and the bridge was opened in 1927 across the Fox River, those houses kind of disappeared.
The 1850s, by that time, McHenry County, the public land had been taken up at probably about $1.25 an acre. You had the development of township government, which brought government close to people. Most people didn't live in villages in that decade. They were out on their farms, which were their office, their factory, their place where they survived and thrived. But they didn't go into town that often because they were pretty self-sufficient. The 1850s also saw in Illinois the passing of the Free School Publication Act, which meant that every child up to age 16 had a right to be educated.
So you had something like 120, 140 one-room schools in McHenry County. So you'd have kids ages 6 to 16 attend school there, and the boys were gone in the spring because they were planting, and they were gone in the fall because of harvest. While schools were kind of the central point of communities, they had to work around these other obstacles that were going on back then.
There was a lot of little old schoolhouses tucked away here and there throughout McHenry. And they built Landmark School on Owens property. That was where the Owen brothers had farmland. The Owens donated the bell for the school. They purchased it and donated it to the school system.
People came out west to get land for farming. Other people also came out because farmers needed things. So McHenry in the 1830s, when it was being founded, you had a grist mill, you had a sawmill, you had dry goods stores, and because you had these things, those people weren't living on farms, so they lived in the town.
There's a lot of historic buildings still here. The Riverside Hotel, that's an interesting story. That was pretty much where everything all started here in McHenry, on that location. In 1864, John Wyer Smith and his nephew built the Riverside Hotel. B.B. Brown had a tavern there, and out of the tavern, I believe they ran the post office, and they did school and church meetings, and that's where everything in McHenry started, and it spread out from there. Now, John Wyer Smith, he built himself a farmhouse at what back then was called Smith Corners. That would be McCullum Lake Road and Ringwood Road, that intersection. He had a store there. His little store wasn't doing well. There was no railroad that went to the Ringwood area. He gathered some of his farmer friends, and they picked up that little store, and they hauled it up to Riverside Drive. They dropped it there, and he ran it as a store for 10 years. Ingenuity. McHenry had what is called three hearts. There was the Main Street area, the Green Street area, and the Riverside Drive area.
No other town in McHenry County has three distinct business districts like we do. They were three separate areas, all with separate functions. We had two post offices. We're the only city in McHenry County that had two post offices.
Because everything started at the corner of Riverside Drive and Elm Street, that was called Old Town.
That developed because it was by the river, and that was the transportation before you had trains, you know. So water was the most important and easiest way to travel.
Green Street was called Centerville.
Center Street was the industrial area. That's where the mills were. That's where the water source through Boone Creek came through.
So now Main Street was called Gagetown after George Gage because George Gage bought up all the property in the Main Street area.
Where you had the stockyards and you had a hotel, the old Northwestern Hotel here.
And it developed into, you know, the businesses and all the buildings that we have now.
There was a ferry that went across the river when they first settled here. And that, because the water was so low, you could get a ferry, or they even had stepping stones in some areas where you get across the river. In the days before the train, you shipped goods by steamboat and by the river. And so it was important that you have enough flowage on the river. Well, there was a lot of movement up around the Spring Grove area and Fox Lake area as to where we needed to have a dam so that we would increase the water level so that we get better shipping. The Spring Grove folks heard that the McHenry people were ready to put in a dam south of McHenry, and they got together and they decided they were going to make a raid on McHenry to make sure the dam didn't get put in. Well, the Civic fathers found out about it, and they hauled an old cannon that they kept and would shoot off every 4th of July, hauled it to the bridge. When the people from the north came down the river, they were all set with this cannon, and they said, if you don't stop, we're going to blow you to hell. The end result of it is nobody got shot, and the cannon wasn't even loaded, but it was enough to scare the people from the Spring Grove area, and that was the last of the physical raids. The first bridge was located where the 120 bridge is, and then it was washed out in a winter ice flow problem. And then the bridge went to what is now Pearl Street. An old iron bridge was built by the Milwaukee Bridge Company, and it was a township bridge. It was a one-way bridge. So in 1976, a group of us bought the township to see if we could get the bridge saved. We got it listed on the National Register, but then it was taken apart. It was a Pratt Truss Bridge, and it was built in 3 sections. One section you can see very well from Route 31 going south by TC Industries, terracotta, because it's used in their parking lot.
In 1872, McHenry became incorporated as a village with government offices.
McHenry was founded by farmers, and that's where the community had gotten its start. Until about the 1920s, you start seeing more and more people slide away from farming and go to other occupations. Also, that's when you start seeing like kind of its peak as being kind of like a touristy town. People would come here for their vacations from the city.
People were now coming out here for the recreational resources that we had along the river, and the development of companies in 1910, the Hunter Boat Company that moved here from Chicago, the Hunter Weckler Boat Company, and had these wonderful steamboats that they could take people up the river and go into the lotus beds up in the Grass Lake area.
It's a huge difference between the 1850s, you're trying to put together a living, where the 1920s, you actually have people who are able to take vacations like we have today.
Periods in history are defined by certain events and happenings. And in the 21st century that we live in, it's technology is what drives us. And in the 20th century, it was communication improvements. When you get to the 19th century, when McHenry was being founded and developed, it was all about transportation. Well, if I had to describe the road system before the train station came out to McHenry, it would have been, frankly, lousy.
In the 1850s, roads were sketchy at best. You only traveled at certain times of year.
Most of our roads here, McCollum Lake Road right out here, Route 14, Route 47, were all roads built by Europeans on top of Native American trails.
It was totally dependent upon the weather. When it rained, you had bogs and swamps and stuff to get through. In some places, like parts of Route 120, were actually corduroy roads because all they were logs lashed together. So you went over swampy areas on this bump, 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 bump road system.
Whereas by 1920s, they're starting to have heavier and heavier farm equipment, which causes them to put together paved roads, things like that. You're starting to see much more reliable roads for transportation.
By 1922, we were now getting Goodyear road maps, which would have been demanded by bicycle riders who'd find themselves out in the hinterland with no directions as to where these towns were and where they were supposed to go. All of that produced your better road movement. And I think it was somewhere around 1914 that the Tyke bill was passed in Illinois that forced all counties to have a highway system and a highway commissioner. So roads became a lot more uniform and hard roads. When the railroad came in, and in McHenry it came in about 1855, instrumental in that was a one-time Lake County surveyor by the name of George Gage.
Basically the man that brought the railroad to McHenry in 1854 on the west side of McHenry. For a while that part of town was called Gagetown.
Because he was a surveyor, he knew where railroad developers were planning to place these things. He knew enough to buy the land that is now West McHenry and buy up all the lots and lay them all out. The railroads came out of Chicago. He was instrumental in getting them to come this way.
He was family-wise part of Lake County, Gage's Lake, if you've heard of that. That's his family. Then he moved out to McHenry.
He also became the first representative in state legislature for McHenry County. He was extremely powerful political man. I built a hotel here. He lived down the street, right across the street from the Methodist Church. So, he was a man of this area.
In 1876, for the United States Centennial, he was asked to write a message, and this is what he says. In the early history, this town's principal production for export was wheat. Grazing, cattle, and pork raising were the farmers' chief reliance. As soil conditions change, grasses such as timothy, clover, and bluegrass flourish. The farmers had large numbers of hogs, sheep, cattle, and horses, which together with butter, cheese, and wood was their main source of revenue.
We did have one very major train wreck about March of 1908 when a freight train loaded with cattle went off the rails, and I know one calf was killed. Of course, the cattle were injured and scattered all over the place. And it was shortly after that that the current train station was built in 1909. It's often said that if you didn't have a railroad come through your town, you weren't going to thrive, and there are plenty of examples of that in McHenry. Coral, for example, Barraville. Hardly anybody knows those names anymore, but they know Crystal Lake, and they know Woodstock, and they certainly know McHenry. Before you had a railroad, it would take you 3 to 4 weeks to get to the East Coast from here. Well, with a train, it was 2 days. And when you had the development of a huge city like Chicago that had a vast network beginning in the 1850s of railroads going out from that hub, McHenry, we couldn't lose. And especially if we had something to supply them with, and we did. That was milk.
Borden's and the Bowmans, they were the companies that the local farmers would run their milk to. So instead of having to run their milk, put it on trains, send it to Chicago, or run it themselves, they could deliver it to these companies, and the companies would give them money back for the milk they were giving them. The problem they were running into is a lot of the prices came from Chicago to the Bordens and Bowmans, and they were kind of dictating what the farmers can get. And so these farm groups helped them get together to negotiate better prices for the milk they were getting paid for. There was one located what's currently behind the CVS, I think southeast of the CVS there.
One of the trains would be a milk train that would go early in the morning and bring milk into the city. Besides dairy products, we shipped ice. We had a canning company here. We had the stockyards here, and so we shipped cattle.
One of the big industries that people have kind of forgotten about is pickles. It was a huge industry. Every town had a pickle plant. And now we have Clausen's in Woodstock, which is kind of the last one around here. But, you know, if you think about before refrigeration, how you're going to preserve things, cucumbers and pickles were a big deal in this area.
I can't emphasize enough how important the railroad was, not only for farmers, but for the entire growth of our country. What the train did was that element of speed was so important and cheapened the cost of everything. And so without the trains, our place in the 20th century and the 21st century probably wouldn't have existed.
So in 1850, they were working about 120,000 acres in McHenry County. And by 1920, they were doing about 396,000. And that's also less and less people are doing farming. More people are getting out of it and going to other jobs.
I'm Sarah Farley. I'm a local food systems and small farms educator with the University of Illinois Extension, and I serve Lake and McHenry counties. In the 2017 Census of Agriculture, there were 881 farms in McHenry County, comprised of 208,339 acres, which is approximately 60% of McHenry County in agricultural land. And with that, there were over 1,500 producers with over 5,000 jobs in agriculture, and 95% of those farms in McHenry County are family-owned. So while the number of farms and the average size of farms in McHenry County has decreased from 2012 to 2017, the number of small farms increased from 162 to 208. And there were also 395 new and beginning farmers during that time. That's 26% of farmers. The number of farmers who fall into the female and Hispanic categories is on the rise. There are 530 farms with 581 female farmers, and 183 of those being new and beginning farmers. For Hispanic and Latinx, the number of farms increased from 30 to 38 with 53 Hispanic operators in McHenry County. The top 5 agricultural products produced in McHenry County are the grains and oil seeds. That's the number one. It comprises of over 50% of agriculture production in the county. Then it goes to the nursery and greenhouse type of crops. Milk from cows is the next category, and cattle and calves. And then the last category is fruit and vegetable production. We have a diverse range of crops, of farming practices here in the county, and that's really exciting. Just thinking of the local economy and what the potential is and avenues to learn from others too. They're finding niche markets and niche avenues to grow their crops, raise their livestock, because in McHenry County, we have the great opportunity of being in the Chicagoland market, where you're able to maybe have higher earners who are more willing to pay more for their food. We have more diversity in our Chicagoland area, so there are certain cultures and backgrounds who prefer, for example, goat meat and sheep and lamb and those type of things around different ethnic holidays, because there's a cultural significance of that. So McHenry County falls pretty high in terms, it's second in the state for the value of sheep, goats, wool, mohair, milk, and other animal products. So I think that there's probably a correlation there because of our proximity and our land and the skills of our growers. I think agriculture will always be needed because we need food, we need clothing, we need to preserve our environment so we can live and enjoy nature around us. Noticing the different opportunities that exist for youth to get involved, the different career pathways that exist within agriculture. Many think that agriculture is just cows and plows when it's so much more. A lot of the skills that are needed in the workforce, they all apply to agriculture too. There is more modernization, STEM opportunities, those type of things within agriculture. Try to think beyond just on the farm, farming practices, as a local producer. There's so many avenues surrounding that. If maybe that's not the drive for agriculture, land access is an issue, so they're supporting opportunities to still be involved in the agriculture industry, whether that be as an educator, in the business, in agribusiness, as a food processor, kind of thinking food science, and in the culinary arts and food science piece of that. Ag mechanics, there will continue to be a need for improvements in machinery so agriculture can be produced efficiently and effectively, and so much more.
We could see in our history that McHenry is an agricultural town, and even though the number of farms and farmers have decreased significantly, you can still see the history of the McHenry's farms around us all today.
This house was acquired by the city of McHenry in 2001. It was plaqued by the Landmark Commission in 1998. It was added to the National Registry in 2021.
There's a lot of wildlife that's still out there, a lot of edible plants. A lot of the plants out in nature are still available for us to harvest. It's very important that we respect Mother Earth. Mother Earth is the provider of all life.
River otters were reintroduced in western McHenry County in the late 1990s, and today they are in every river system in the county. Here at Glacial Park, one winter a couple of years ago, we caught a family of 6 otters on a trail cam, just sliding down the snow on the banks, having a good time. Bald eagles now nest in McHenry County again. There are several active nests. Here at Glacial Park, we have ospreys or fishhawks nesting for the first time in decades. Badgers have returned.
There is a bright future. There is a huge responsibility, though, of the next generation to really recognize that and prioritize that and really think sustainably and think long-term about how to manage and preserve and conserve and keep acres of good quality land in production and really maintain the soil, amend the soil, keep those nutrients in the soil to better our environment.
Certain crops will use more of a particular type of nutrients in the soil than other crops. So if you rotate them, you're not removing the same nutrient from the soil year after year. Other things such as cover crops, where they're growing a second crop planted later in the summer or early fall, where it covers the soil with some green plant so it protects it from soil erosion.
Here in McHenry County, we have some of the richest soil in the world, and many don't realize that. You ask a soil scientist in Pennsylvania if they got a farmland in McHenry County, they would be thrilled.
Well, it's important to remember that this is a legacy that belongs not only to the past, to the glacial history, to the deep time that's part of McHenry County, but it belongs to the future as well.
You young people, if you look at the parks that we have in this area, all of that is yours. It is yours. Keep it clean.
Conservation sites are places where you can see plants and animals and you can enjoy a hike in the woods and you can look at flowers. But they're also a place that allows you to place your own self back in time. And as a result, see yourself as part of a long chain that stretches back to those glaciers.
We want to make sure that we pass this cultural information on because we live in this world that we need to protect ourselves for the future, to ensure that we're going to have clean water.
When I began work for the district 40 years ago, there was 20 acres of original prairie left in McHenry County out of probably 150,000 acres of original prairie. And that was scattered in scraps and little postage stamps, places that no one really wanted to do anything with. So the district has been rescuing those native communities for the past 50 years, and we engage in a lot of natural community restoration in our sites. So we restore prairies, and where it's possible to do so without impacting the neighbors, we remove those drain tiles and we allow the wetland to reassert itself. And we have a very active program of planting oaks. It's called the Big Woods Program, and we are restoring big woods in terms of acreages in McHenry County. And the idea behind that is there has to always be places where people can go to feel the past and to understand that they are part of that past as well as the future.